didn't realize you were taking classes at Stanford. Did you get a master's there, or?
No. When Lloyd called me to go over to Turkey and Germany, it was past the cutoff where you couldn't drop classes. But I had to drop classes anyway. So I went to the Dean of Men, at the time was a guy by the name of Richard Lyman. Ultimately became president, but he stood up and told me I should know better, that I can't drop classes past a certain date, and essentially that I was a jerk. And I said, well, I'm not paying for this. My boss is. He needs me to do something. I don't care about him. I said, well, why don't you take this school and hang it up here? So that's where we ended up. So I never, although I was never impressed with a lot of things at Stanford, compared to a small school like RIT. However, there's an awful lot of smart people there that maybe weren't instructors, but they were there doing a lot of things, making Stanford a lot of money, military contracts, things like that, or like things that Mike and Ron were working on, the radio science stuff, that they were getting paid very handsomely to do. All that course came to a screeching halt in 1969 when the campus got raided by the Vietnam protesters, and all of a sudden the government set up a lot of private companies like Argo Systems, and made a lot of those professors an awful lot of money later in life. But I got to do a lot of custom products for these guys through Peter. We did a lot of things for Sylvania. Did multi-couplers, tube-type multi-couplers. We were using General Electric had a triode, an RF triode that was 7768. And it was a real high dynamic range. A great device for broadband. But we did an awful lot of multi-couplers for Sylvania. Multi-coupler basically is a signal comes in and splits many different ways with high power output to distribute through cable on an aircraft carrier, a destroyer, or whatever. Did a lot of that for Sylvania in Mountain View. Peter didn't want to grow. Bert and I had messed around, and Phil Woodwell was there at the time too, another old friend. But I had Bert build a couple of solid state amplifiers to try, and they worked. So we had some nice, relatively broadband transistor amplifiers in the early 60s, and there had to be a market. And Peter didn't want to sell it. He didn't want the company to grow. He'd go away for 2 or 3 months, leave me in charge. I was a pretty young guy at the time, and we always made money for him. We made a lot of money for him, but he just didn't want to progress.
You were only in your mid-20s by that point, right?
63. I was probably maybe 26, 25, something like that. Yeah. But anyway, so I thought about all that. I thought about the Stanford offer and things like that, and then so I said, why don't I go see what Fred and Harold are doing? And Fred was Fred Schumacher from Turkey. Harold was his partner, and they alternated in Turkey. I don't think they ever went to Germany. I don't know. Maybe they did. But they had formed a consulting firm. And these guys were... Harold was a business guy. although he was an engineer, Georgia Tech. You know, he was a Georgia Tech loyalist. The only school in the world was Georgia Tech, but a good man. Fred was a physicist, bright. They'd worked at GE, they'd worked at Huggins, where they had done TWTs, and then MEC, yeah. And he'd done a lot of stuff there, but Harold had been involved with power supplies for those kind of things. And he was he's an old Air Force officer, World War II Air Force officer, probably good 20 years older than me, at least. But these guys, they were just starting in Mountain View, and it turns out they were right next door to where Reconix was moving to. So they were making the first tunnel diode amplifiers. And Fred said to me, he said, I need to hire an engineer that's a good microwave guy. And Bob Mao was a guy that I had met at Mel Labs. That he was a very, very quiet man, never said much, but I was always impressed with his knowledge of, microwave techniques and things like that. And I said, you probably should try to get in touch with Bob Mao, which they did, and they hired him. And then they started doing, a few amplifiers here and there, and there was like 4 of them. They had the lady up front, which the Japanese lady who ultimately became Fred's second or third wife, I don't know which, but her name was Irene, young woman, Bob and Harold. And then they had a technician by the name of, who was a Danish guy, incredibly clever, by the name of Peter Toft Nielsen. And he could build anything mechanically. So anyway, I started doing some amplifiers on the side. Peter didn't want to do them, so I figured, well, I'll make a little extra money. So I designed a few amplifiers, which, they sold. Then I did HP had come out with this thing called a double balance mixer. And I said, I know how to do that. So we did one that was like an inch square. Theirs was like this, big H. And so Bob looked at that structure, which we did with ferrite cores and things, and he took it all the way up to 18 gigahertz with a patented thing called an orthostar. And Bob was brilliant. He could design anything mechanically. He had 2 left feet, but Fred knew, where that weakness was. And Bob had no interest at all in customers or promotion or anything like that. So then I decided to go there full time. So I was probably the 5th or 6th guy there. And we started to really grow. We were still in Mountain View at the time.
And what was the name of that company again?
Aertech.
So that was Aertech then?
That was Aertech, right? Yeah. Yeah, it was formed by Fred and Harold as a consulting firm, but then, they saw this opportunity for solid state amplifiers.
And it was all funded kind of out of their pockets, or?
Oh yeah. Yeah. But in those days you could get a lot of money for things, and we weren't all getting paid an awful lot of money. So, but I mean, things we could charge thousands of dollars for, you could probably buy for $30 today. And the dollar went much further in those days. It was a relatively lucrative business. It really was. They grew quite rapidly, almost all in the military electronics space. I did a lot of the proposals because Bob had no interest in any of that. So when a system requirement had come in, I'd write the proposals, and and then I'd run it past Harold, and he was a promoter, and he was a good BSer, great guy. But I'd travel to a lot of the sites, and basically go over all the boring stuff that people needed to hear, reliability and MTBF and repairability and on. Things that were important, and to the prime contractors in those days. And we did a lot of things. We did an awful lot of things. One of the funniest things. Bob had although very quiet, a tremendous sense of humor, and he'd quietly mock Harold sometimes. You could hear Harold, all on the phone, and so we used to have Peter make mock-ups. Tunnel diode amplifier looked like a piece of brown metal with two connectors on it. So Peter'd take a wooden block and make it look like with a label and paint it right. Make it look like a tunnel diode amplifier. So Bob says one day, we got to rent space next to that ad with an arrow that says, "This is a wooden box." I says, I think we can do that. So we both knew this guy by the name of Harry Eustace, who had his own magazine, Microwave Magazine. And we spent, he used to buy us lunch every once in a while to find out what was going on and things like that. And so we convinced Harry that we should take this and do that. And he did. Well, it was priceless because Harold come raging back, and he knew who did it. "What did you guys do? This is not professional. This is ridiculous." "Oh, okay, sorry, Harold." About a week later, he came back. He said, "That's one of the best things that ever happened." He says, "I got more phone calls on that box because people didn't, it was just, they laughed, and then, well, what is it? Yeah. They called me and asked me what it was." So anyway.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, we did a lot of stuff, crazy things like that.
How long were you at Aertech then?
Probably 1964 to 1970.